This is not how diplomatic incidents are supposed to unfold. There is a protocol, a careful choreography where ambassadors deliver messages through established channels, where disagreements are managed quietly, where public statements are calibrated to avoid escalation. That protocol exists because it serves both parties. It allows governments to navigate differences without forcing confrontations that make compromise politically impossible. What happened in the third week of March 2025 violated that protocol deliberately, and the violation was not accidental. It was a miscalculation about power, about leverage, and about whether Canada would continue to absorb public criticism from American officials without responding in kind. The United States ambassador to Canada, Pete Hoekstra, gave an interview to a major Canadian news network in which he expressed, in language that was unusually direct for diplomatic communication, his disappointment with the Canadian government's approach to trade negotiations and resource cooperation. The specific phrase that generated the firestorm was his statement that the United States had hoped for a bigger deal. A comprehensive agreement that would address trade, defense cooperation, and resource access in a framework that served both countries' interests. The framing was deliberate. By characterizing Canadian reluctance to expand negotiations as a failure to reach a bigger deal, Hoekstra was implying that Canada was being small-minded, parochial, unwilling to think strategically about the bilateral relationship. The implication was that Canada was missing an opportunity, that American patience was finite, and that the current trajectory was disappointing to Washington. This was not diplomacy. This was public pressure designed to force Canadian concessions by creating the impression that Canada was the obstacle to a more productive relationship. The response from Mark Carney's government was swift, public, and calibrated to inflict maximum political cost on the American position without appearing defensive. Carney held a press conference less than 24 hours after Hoekstra's interview aired. The tone was measured, controlled, and devastating. Carney did not defend Canada's negotiating position. He reframed the entire conversation by exposing what a bigger deal actually meant in practice. According to Carney's statement, which was based on classified diplomatic exchanges that he chose to declassify for the purposes of the press conference, the bigger deal that American negotiators had proposed included provisions that would require Canada to provide preferential access to critical mineral deposits, to structure water export agreements that guaranteed American industrial access, regardless of Canadian environmental or sovereignty concerns, and to commit to defense procurement decisions that would lock Canadian military systems into American supply chains for decades. The declassification was not standard practice. It was a deliberate escalation designed to make clear that Canada was no longer willing to have its negotiating positions misrepresented in public, while the substance of American demands remained confidential. The effect was immediate. The provisions that Carney outlined were not framed as partnership proposals. They were structured as requirements, and when those requirements were made public, the characterization of Canadian reluctance shifted from obstructionism to sovereignty protection. The political damage to the American position was substantial, because once the substance of a bigger deal was public, it became impossible for American officials to claim that Canada was simply being difficult. The proposals revealed a fundamental asymmetry in how the two governments understood the negotiation. From Washington's perspective, the negotiation was about securing American access to Canadian resources. From Ottawa's perspective, it was about defining terms under which Canada would cooperate while maintaining sovereignty. Those are not compatible frameworks, and Carney's declassification made that incompatibility visible in ways that forced American officials into defensive positions. The critical minerals issue became the focal point. Canada controls substantial deposits of lithium, rare earth elements, cobalt, and other materials that are essential for battery production, renewable energy systems, and advanced manufacturing. These materials have become strategically critical as the United States attempts to reduce dependency on Chinese supply chains. American negotiators had proposed, according to the declassified documents, that Canada commit to supply agreements that would guarantee American companies priority access to Canadian mineral production at prices linked to production cost rather than market value. The agreements would run for 30 years and would include provisions limiting Canadian ability to export to third countries if doing so would reduce availability for American purchasers. These are not terms that sovereign countries accept voluntarily. These are terms that colonial powers impose on dependent territories. And Carney's decision to make them public was a statement that Canada would not be treated as a dependent territory, regardless of the economic or security pressure Washington chose to apply. The reaction in Canadian public opinion was immediate and overwhelmingly supportive. Polling conducted in the week following the press conference showed approval ratings for the government's handling of United States relations reaching levels not seen in over a decade. The phrase "bigger deal" became shorthand in Canadian political discourse for American overreach and Canadian resistance. The reaction in Washington was more complex. Publicly, State Department officials characterized Carney's declassification as unhelpful. Privately, according to sources familiar with internal discussions, there was recognition that Hoekstra's public criticism had created a political dynamic that made it impossible for Canada to make concessions without appearing to capitulate to pressure. This is a basic principle of negotiation. When you publicly criticize a negotiating partner and characterize their position as disappointing, you remove their ability to compromise without losing domestic political support. Carney could not agree to expanded resource access agreements after Hoekstra had publicly framed Canadian reluctance as obstruction. Any agreement reached after that framing would be seen by Canadian voters as capitulation. The episode revealed a misunderstanding in Washington about how the Canada-United States relationship has changed and about whether Canada still operates from a position where American disapproval creates sufficient political pressure to force policy changes. For decades, that assumption held. Canadian governments were sensitive to American criticism because the economic relationship was so asymmetric that antagonizing Washington carried real costs. But the economic asymmetry has narrowed. Canada's diversification of trade relationships, its infrastructure investments that create alternative export routes, its partnerships with European and Asian countries on critical minerals, all of this has reduced Canadian vulnerability to American economic pressure. When vulnerability decreases, the political cost of American disapproval decreases with it. And when the political cost is low, public criticism from American officials stops being a negotiating tool and starts being a political gift to Canadian leaders who benefit from being seen as defending sovereignty against foreign pressure. Carney understood this dynamic. Hoekstra apparently did not. The bigger deal that Washington wanted required Canadian cooperation on resource access, on defense integration, on regulatory harmonization that would subordinate Canadian decision-making to American strategic priorities. That cooperation was never going to be achieved through public pressure. It could only be achieved through negotiation that acknowledged Canada as a partner with legitimate sovereignty interests. The declassification destroyed any possibility of achieving that cooperation in the near term. Because once the terms of American proposals were public, Canadian negotiators could not agree to them without triggering massive political backlash. Carney had effectively foreclosed the possibility of a bigger deal by making the substance of that deal politically toxic. This was not an accident. It was strategy. The timing was particularly significant given the approaching USMCA review in 2026. By forcing the resource access issue into public debate in early 2025, Carney was establishing the political framework that would define Canadian negotiating positions when formal review discussions began. The message to Washington was clear. Canada will not be pressured into agreements that subordinate sovereignty to American strategic priorities, and attempts to create public pressure will backfire. The critical minerals leverage is real and substantial. The United States needs Canadian lithium and rare earth elements to build battery production capacity, to reduce dependency on Chinese supply chains, and to support the clean energy transition that is central to current industrial policy. Europe needs the same materials for the same reasons. Canada controls the supply. And control of supply, when the resource is strategically critical, translates into negotiating power. Carney's government has been methodical in positioning Canada to exercise that power. The geological surveys that identified mineral deposits, the infrastructure investments that make extraction economically viable, the partnerships with European countries that create alternative markets, all of this was done quietly while Washington focused on tariffs and trade disputes. The result is that Canada enters resource negotiations with options. If the United States will not pay fair market value for Canadian minerals, Canada can sell to Europe. If Europe imposes conditions that Canada finds unacceptable, Canada can sell to Asian markets. The diversification of potential customers eliminates the monopoly leverage that the United States historically exercised over Canadian resource exports. This is the fundamental shift that makes a bigger deal impossible on American terms. The deal Washington wants requires Canadian dependency, but Canada is not dependent, and public pressure from ambassadors does not create dependency. It creates resentment and political incentives for Canadian leaders to demonstrate independence. The Hoekstra interview and Carney's response will be studied in diplomatic training programs as an example of how not to manage alliance relationships. The error was not in having disagreements. The error was in making those disagreements public in ways that forced the Canadian government to choose between sovereignty and partnership, and then being surprised when sovereignty won. The phrase "polite Canada" that appears frequently in American political discourse reflects a fundamental misunderstanding. Canada has been accommodating in past negotiations, not because of cultural politeness, but because the economic and security relationship made accommodation strategically rational. When that calculus changes, the relationship changes. And the change is not temporary, it is structural. The infrastructure Canada has built over the past 7 years, the Arctic ports, the critical mineral processing facilities, the diversified trade relationships, the defense production capabilities, all of this is permanent. It does not disappear because American officials express disappointment. It exists as a foundation for Canadian strategic autonomy that did not exist a decade ago. The bigger deal that might have been possible in 2018 or 2020, when Canada had fewer alternatives and greater dependency on American market access, is not possible in 2025. The options have changed. The leverage has shifted. And attempts to pressure Canada through public criticism reveal that Washington has not adjusted to the new reality. Carney's declassification was a message about that reality. It was a statement that Canada will not be publicly criticized without response, that American proposals will not remain confidential if they are misrepresented in public forums, and that the era of Canadian accommodation to American priorities without reciprocal respect for Canadian sovereignty has ended. The reaction in Allied capitals was attentive. European governments that have their own resource dependency concerns recognized the precedent. A middle power with substantial resource endowments had publicly refused to subordinate sovereignty to alliance pressure and had done so in ways that imposed political costs on the larger power. That precedent matters beyond Canada. The ambassador who gave the interview that triggered the crisis remains in his post. But the diplomatic damage has been done. Canadian negotiators entering the 2026 USMCA review will not be operating under the assumption that American disapproval needs to be avoided. They will be operating under the framework Carney established. Sovereignty is not negotiable, resources will be priced at fair market value, and public pressure will be met with public accountability. This is not the end of the Canada-United States relationship. It is a redefinition of that relationship on terms that acknowledge changed realities. Power has shifted. Options have multiplied. And the country that spent 7 years building alternatives is now using those alternatives as leverage. The bigger deal Washington wanted required a Canada that no longer exists. The Canada that exists now has different priorities, different options, and different tolerance for being treated as a subordinate. And the ambassador who did not recognize that distinction has provided the current government with a political gift that will define Canadian-American relations for the next decade. By the time this is acknowledged in Washington, the leverage will already be normalized, and the assumption that Canada can be pressured into compliance will be history.